It was an ordinary Tuesday. I was settled into the ranger station, an old wooden structure nestled among the dense greenery of North Carolina's woods. The sun slanted through the gaps in the heavy canopy, the uneven spots of light dancing on the worn oak desk in front of me. The faint, lingering scent of damp moss clung to the walls, painting an unshakable image of the wild, unyielding nature that lay beyond. I gazed out of the window. The sight of towering trees, a sea of green and brown extending as far as the eye could see, always filled me with a quiet dread. A trepidation that bore the weight of secrets concealed within the profound depths of the forest. Its silent watchfulness echoed in the hushed whispers of the leaves. The crackle of my walkie-talkie interrupted my musings. "Ranger Hawkins, do you copy? Over." I snatched the device from its holster, holding the button down as I responded. "This is Hawkins. Go ahead. Over. 10 hikers have gone missing. We need you to join the search party. Over." My heart skipped a beat. "Missing? Any leads on their last location? Last known coordinates point towards the Northern Mountain Trail. Over." The Northern Mountain Trail, a rugged, challenging trek that would test even the most experienced hiker. I remembered them now, a group of spirited college students who had stopped by the ranger station a week ago, their laughter echoing through the room, faces flushed with excitement and naivety. 10 of them, bright and beaming, filled with youthful bravado and an eagerness to conquer the wilderness. "All right," I said, trying to shake off the unsettling sensation crawling up my spine. "I'll gear up and head out. Over and out." I pushed back my chair, my worn-out boots thudding against the wooden floor as I paced across the room. The gear hung on the back wall, clean and organized. My headlamp, knife, extra batteries, first aid kit, compass, water purifier, map, and more. Essentials for navigating the treacherous terrain of the forest. As I gathered the gear, my mind drifted back to the group of hikers. They were so young, full of life and the promise of adventure, the glint of anticipation in their eyes. Yet here I was, tasked with finding them in the belly of this beast we called home. The memories of past search and rescue missions flooded back. Faces of the missing, etched in my mind, their smiles faded into fear and regret. The forest could be merciless, unforgiving, swallowing the unwary in its endless green abyss. Its alluring beauty hid its dangers well, and the ones who underestimated it often paid the highest price. Securing my gear, I picked up the walkie-talkie once more. "Ranger Hughes, this is Hawkins. I'm heading out. Over." "Copy that, Hawkins. Be careful out there. Over and out." I stepped out of the station, the scent of wet earth filling my nostrils, the chorus of the wilderness resonating in my ears. I started towards the Northern Trail, my heart echoing with silent prayers for those lost souls, hoping that this time, we weren't too late. As I approached the rendezvous point, I spotted the familiar figures of my colleagues. Strong, seasoned men accustomed to the forest's temperament, they bore the same expression of solemnity that I felt. We exchanged terse greetings, our usual camaraderie muted by the gravity of our mission. "Hawkins," Tom, a grizzled veteran with a peppered beard, said, his deep voice resonating in the quiet forest. "Got here fast." "Can't waste time," I replied, meeting his gaze. The others, Brad, Alan, and Ricky, nodded in agreement, their faces grim. We moved in a single file, our steps muted on the soft forest floor. Tom led the way, the map rustling in his grip as he traced the hiker's path. We moved through the thick undergrowth, the morning mist swirling around us, wrapping the forest in an ethereal shroud. It was eerily silent. The usual buzz of the forest quietened, as if it too was holding its breath. We continued our search, the only sound being the rustling of leaves under our boots, the occasional crackle from the walkie-talkie, and our rhythmic breathing. After hours of tracking, we found something, a trail that veered from the main path. The oddity was instantly alarming. It led into one of the less explored parts of the forest, an area filled with treacherous terrain and thick foliage. "They left the trail," Brad murmured, squinting at the faint footprints on the moist ground. "But why?" We exchanged uneasy glances. "Might be they got disoriented or chased by some animal," Alan suggested, his voice hushed. "But we know the wildlife here, Alan. They don't chase humans, not unless threatened," Ricky countered. "Maybe they decided on a detour, got a thrill from wandering off the beaten track," I added, knowing the allure of such adrenaline-fueled decisions. Yet, my gut churned with unease. Into this part of the forest? Doesn't seem right, Tom muttered, stroking his beard, eyes scanning the treacherous path ahead. We stood at the edge of the unfamiliar, gazing into the dense undergrowth. The towering trees stretched into the cloud-filled sky, the lower branches laden with moss and creepers. Their trunks were so wide that it would take several men to encircle them. The forest was darker here, sunlight unable to penetrate the thick, leafy canopy. A cool wind blew, rustling the leaves, the sound a low whisper among the trees. This is a death wish, and they knew that. The briefing was clear, Brad murmured, unease creeping into his voice. No use speculating. We need to find them, Tom decided. We nodded, each of us carrying our own apprehensions, as we embarked on the divergent path the hikers had taken. We trudged on, the weight of the foreboding forest bearing down on us. As we penetrated deeper into the wilderness, the feeling of unease deepened, an intangible chill creeping along our spines. The forest grew denser, the shadows darker, the silence heavier. The air around us was thick with tension, a stillness that almost seemed unnatural. Through the dense undergrowth, we caught a glimpse of something odd, the remains of a camp. We quickened our pace, hearts pounding in our chests. My breath hitched as we drew nearer. On the grass, under the indifferent gaze of the colossal trees, lay a body. A young man sprawled on the dew-dampened grass, his body contorted unnaturally. His eyes were wide open, a look of horror etched onto his face as though he had seen his worst nightmare come alive. His limbs were spread out as though he had tried to escape something, and his final moments were spent in terror. I approached the body, my heart pounding. Brad joined me, his usual vibrant eyes now clouded with dread. Cautiously, he pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, looking for any sign of life. There was none. The guy was dead. A cold shiver ran down my spine, a wave of terror washing over me. We were all silent, a sense of dread wrapping around us like a shroud. Rousing ourselves, we proceeded to the camp. The scene before us was chilling. A single tent stood in a small clearing, its entrance gaping open like a silent scream. The remains of a campfire lay nearby, the ashes cold and gray. "God, what happened here?" Ricky muttered, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the air, unanswered. We shared a collective apprehension. This was unlike anything we had ever seen before. Then Alan, who had ventured into the tent, called out in a strangled voice, "Guys!" His voice drew us towards the tent. Inside, we found another body, a young woman this time. She too wore an expression of sheer terror, her arms curled around herself as though she were trying to protect herself from something monstrous. Her death was as disturbing and mysterious as the young man's. Horror coursed through us. These weren't just unfortunate accidents. This was something sinister, something terrifying. The silence of the forest was deafening, the forest's many eyes watching our every move. The twisted faces of the hikers haunted our thoughts, each of us wondering the same dreadful thought. What unspeakable terror had they faced in their final moments? We stared at each other in stunned silence, the bodies in front of us chilling reminders of the hidden terrors that the forest held. Taking a deep breath, I reached for my walkie-talkie. "This is Hawkins. We need backup and forensic support at our coordinates. We found bodies," I choked out, my voice echoing in the silence. "Copy, Hawkins. We're sending a team right away," came the static-filled reply. With the call made, we set about the grim task of searching for survivors. The search was eerily quiet, only the sound of rustling leaves and the hushed whispers of the forest accompanying us. But there was nothing. No sign of the other hikers, no clue as to what had happened. Then, a blood-curdling scream tore through the silence, making our hearts pound in our chests. It was Tom. We rushed towards him, our hearts hammering in our throats. As we approached, we saw him standing rigid, his eyes wide with terror, looking up. Confused, we followed his gaze. My breath hitched as I saw another body, this time in the gnarled branches of an ancient tree. A young man, his arms tightly wrapped around a thick branch, his body frozen in a terrifying climb for escape. His face, too, bore the same mask of horror we had seen on the others. He was caught in a moment of unimaginable fear, his eyes wide and empty, his mouth opened in a silent scream. He had died attempting to escape from something that had terrified him to his very core. Shock washed over us, an icy wave of dread that left us numb. Our eyes remained glued to the gruesome sight above, the stark horror of the scene rendering us speechless. What had driven these hikers to such desperate ends? What terror had pursued them, turning their adventure into a nightmare? A sense of foreboding clung to us as we resumed our search, the chilling discoveries echoing in our minds. The once comforting whispers of the forest now seemed menacing, the towering trees intimidating sentinels hiding an unspeakable horror. We continued our search, the memory of the horrific discoveries haunting our every step. The forest seemed to close in on us, the gloomy undergrowth a maze of unseen terrors. As we ventured further, a gruesome sight greeted us. At the bottom of a steep cliff, 2 more bodies lay twisted and broken, evidence of a fatal fall. Like the others, they bore expressions of stark terror, their eyes wide, their bodies stiff. It seemed they had jumped in a desperate attempt to escape whatever had been pursuing them. A hollow feeling of dread settled in my gut as we noted the absence of 2 more hikers. Despite our most thorough efforts, we found no trace of them. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Soon, the sound of helicopters filled the air, breaking the haunting silence of the forest. The backup team had arrived, their grim faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. Despite their assistance and the thorough combing of the forest, the missing students were never found. The horrifying incident was soon plastered all over the news, turning the tranquil forest into a place of morbid curiosity. The inexplicable deaths of the hikers became a magnet for thrill seekers, paranormal investigators, and conspiracy theorists alike. For them, it was a mystery to be solved, a tantalizing enigma to be dissected and theorized over. But for me, it was a chilling reminder of the unseen horrors that the forest can harbor. The memory of those terrified faces, their eyes wide with horror, their desperate attempts to escape. It was a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was left with more questions than answers, and a creeping sense of dread that would forever lurk at the back of my mind, a grim souvenir from the darkest day of my career. I've been out of the Ranger service for 2 years now. Retirement, they call it. A chance to rest the old bones, to stoke the fire in the hearth, not a campfire under the open stars. Surrounded by the comforts of home, my family close by, the grandchildren rapt with attention as they huddle closer to the fireside, I find my eyes drawn to the flickering flames, my mind lost in the memories they conjure. Grandpa Carl, tell us a story, my youngest grandchild Lily implores, her wide, innocent eyes sparkling in the firelight. A chuckle escapes my lips. You want to hear about the time your old grandpa used to work the wilds as a ranger, huh? I ask, knowing the answer. I can see their eager nods, feel their anticipation. I gaze into the fire as the flames dance, and the shadows they cast become the trees and creatures of the forest in my mind. You know, kids, I start, every forest in this world, it's a living organism. Got its own character, its own mood. Sometimes it welcomes you, wraps you in its peace and beauty. Other times it bares its teeth, brings danger, reminds you that you're a guest in its vast wilderness. I see them hanging onto my words, their young minds, absorbing, understanding. I was a young man, green as the summer leaves, when I started as an assistant chief ranger in the national park, I recall, a wistful smile crossing my weathered face. I saw many things in those years, both good and bad. It was a calling, not just a job. But one thing, one event from those days still chills my blood. I pause, glancing around at the faces surrounding me. They're captivated, hushed, waiting for me to reveal the mystery. I let the silence build a moment longer, then continue. It was mid-July, hot as a firecracker, I remember. I was still fresh, maybe a bit overeager, wanting to make a difference, wanting to protect my forest. I inhale, the scent of the burning wood bringing back the memory even stronger. That's when it happened. And what happened, Grandpa? My eldest grandson Ben asks, leaning forward, his curiosity piqued. I cast my gaze to the crackling fire again. A log collapses in the fireplace, throwing up a swarm of sparks. A knot tightens in my chest as I remember. I take a deep breath, steeling myself to delve back into the shadows of the past, I know this is just the beginning, the opening of the gates to a memory long held in the abyss of time. Let's take it slow, kids, I say, a wistful sigh escaping my lips. It's a story that needs its time. I know they are ready for the story, but I also know they are not ready for the darkness it holds. And as I sit there, ready to venture back into the shadowed woods of the past, I realize that perhaps I am not ready either. Those early days in the national park were filled with peace and monotony, a stark contrast to the image I had of an adventurous ranger life. But I was content, ready to learn from my more experienced colleagues. They were good men, grizzled veterans of the wilderness who welcomed me into their fold, taught me the tricks of the trade, helped me find my footing in the untamed wilderness we were tasked with protecting. Months flew by, and I became more comfortable in my role, more confident in my strides as I patrolled the forest. But as they say, overconfidence can be a dangerous thing. It was on one of these overconfident days, 3 months into my tenure, that I ventured too deep into the woods. I remember it like it was yesterday. The air was heavy with the musk of damp earth, the trees towering above me like ancient guardians. I was alone, the usually comforting silence of the forest, suddenly eerie and unsettling. And then I saw it. Nestled between towering oaks and shrouded in thick undergrowth, a small hill crowned by a cave. I stood there, a young ranger facing the mouth of the unknown, a primal pull tugging at me, coaxing me to step closer. I remember the strange attraction, the way the dark void of the cave beckoned me. I could almost hear it whispering my name, but I understood the dangers it could hold. It could be a den of a predatory animal, a shelter to unknown threats. It took every ounce of my willpower to turn back, to leave the mystery of the cave unexplored. Back at the ranger hut, I recounted my discovery to my colleagues. Their reaction was nothing I had expected. The jovial atmosphere was replaced by a heavy silence, their faces hardening as I described the cave. Bari, a senior ranger, a man of few words, was the most perturbed. He shot up from his chair, his gruff voice demanding, "Did you see any warning signs, Carl? Did you see anything that said you shouldn't be there?" I was taken aback by his agitation. "No," I answered truthfully. "There weren't any signs." Bari's bushy eyebrows furrowed in worry. He paced the room, running his hands through his thinning hair. Finally, he turned to me, his stern gaze drilling into mine. "Listen here, boy. You're never to go near that cave again. Do you understand? That part of the forest is strictly forbidden. It's dangerous." "But why?" I pressed, the mystery of the cave piquing my curiosity even more. Bari sighed, a look of deep sorrow clouding his face. "That cave," he began, "has been here for centuries. No one knows how deep it goes or what lives within it. All we know is that whoever enters never returns. Man, beast, bird, none who venture in ever come out." The revelation sent chills down my spine, the mysterious cave now tainted with a sinister hue. "Avoid that part of the forest, Carl. We've lost good men to that damned cave," he added, his voice barely a whisper. The warning stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the forest. I heeded Bari's advice and never ventured into the forbidden part of the forest. I was a ranger, tasked with safeguarding the wilderness, not awakening the unknown. I kept my distance from the cave, respected the boundary drawn by the forest itself. And for years, life continued, tranquil and undisturbed, the forest becoming a second home, my guardian and guide. Time, as it tends to do, swept forward, bringing with it changes that even the stoic forest couldn't resist. The young ranger who once explored the park with awe and trepidation had matured into a seasoned man, entrusted with the responsibility of safeguarding the wilderness I had come to call my home. With Bari's retirement, I stepped into the shoes of the senior ranger, a role that brought its own challenges. The entire park, including the forbidden part of the forest, fell under my watchful gaze. I was to ensure the safety of hikers and animals alike, and most importantly, keep everyone away from that godforsaken cave. I made sure the warning signs were never out of sight, the trails leading away from the perilous part of the forest. I even shared the chilling tale of the cave with every new ranger, a cautionary tale to keep them vigilant and safe. One such ranger was Steve, a lively young man with sparkling eyes and an insatiable curiosity. I took him under my wing, shared the wisdom I had accumulated over the years, warned him about the cave, its mysteries and dangers. And then, one ordinary day turned into a nightmare. A frantic voice crackled over the radio, announcing that several hikers, along with Steve, had gone missing. My heart sank. The last reported location was dangerously close to the forbidden zone. The anger that boiled within me was as much directed at myself as it was at Steve. I had trusted him, believed that he had understood the danger, but anger wouldn't find them. Anger wouldn't help them. I needed to act, and act fast. Gathering my gear, I steeled myself for the treacherous path I was about to tread. I was venturing into the forbidden part of the forest, an area I had deliberately avoided for years. The moment I crossed the invisible boundary into the forbidden zone, I felt it. A shift in the air, a tangible heaviness that weighed on my shoulders, a silence that hummed with unsaid warnings, a dread that coiled around my heart. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, watching me with unseen eyes. My experienced gaze combed the surroundings, looking for any signs of the missing group. I had a strange sense of déjà vu, the young ranger in me recognizing the unfamiliarity, the dread. But I was not that young ranger anymore. I was the guardian of the forest, and I had a duty to fulfill. Soon, I came upon their camp. The abandoned tents flapped in the icy wind, their belongings scattered in disarray. The eerie silence was broken by the rustling of leaves. A wave of unease washed over me. Something had spooked them, something more terrifying than just a beast of the forest. I could feel it in my bones, a cold dread seeping into me. The campsite was too close to the cave, too close for comfort. I found myself drawn towards the dark void of the cave, a familiar dread gnawing in my stomach. A part of me wished I could turn back, retreat to the safety of the known. But the ranger in me, the man who had pledged to protect, knew there was only one way forward. With every step, the cave loomed larger, the air grew heavier, the silence deepened. My heart pounded in my chest, a throbbing rhythm of fear and resolve. My eyes roved around the abandoned campsite, looking for signs of a struggle, of any clues about what might have happened. That's when I heard it. A rustling in the underbrush, a sound that set my heart pounding, my senses on high alert. Shadows danced between the trees, the chilling wind whispering secrets into the rustling leaves. Then, out of the gloom, a figure burst out, almost knocking me off my feet. A woman, her hair wild, eyes wide with terror. She stumbled, collapsing at my feet, her breath coming out in ragged gasps. I crouched down beside her, trying to soothe her panicked breathing. Slowly, her gasps subsided, and she began to come around, her terror-stricken eyes finally focusing on me. "What's your name? Where are the others?" I questioned, hoping to get some answers. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Emily. I'm Emily. We were reporters. We were doing a story on the cave. Heard about its secrets. Steve. He guided us here." I could feel my heart sinking with every word she spoke. They had knowingly ventured into the forbidden part of the forest, lured by the allure of the cave's ominous mystery. Emily continued her tale, her voice barely above a whisper. They had started filming near the cave. Then, something unexplainable happened. A strange, irresistible pull seemed to draw them towards the cave. Emily had somehow managed to resist, halting at the mouth of the cave while the others were drawn into the abyss. The account of her waiting by the cave chilled me to the core. Her voice shook as she described the screams, the pleas for help that echoed from within. Her friends, Steve, all swallowed by the darkness of the cave. And then there was Steve, pale as a ghost, eyes void of life, beckoning Emily to join him in the cave. His call, compelling her, pulling her towards the abyss. She had barely managed to resist, to turn around and run. The fear in Emily's eyes was palpable as she pleaded with me to rescue her colleagues, including Steve. She believed that they were still alive, that there was still a chance to save them. The desperation in her voice, the hope in her eyes, it reminded me of the young ranger I once was. As Emily finished her chilling tale, I couldn't shake off the dread sinking into my gut. I knew the cave's reputation, but hearing her story, it was something else entirely. Despite Emily's pleas, I decided against venturing into the cave immediately. Instead, we returned to the ranger cabin, where I promptly dialed the sheriff, recounting our discovery and Emily's terrifying experience. The dawn found us in the company of the sheriff and a specialist he had brought along. A tiny drone with a remote control and a live camera feed was their answer to our predicament. Emily, still shaken, was left back at the cabin. She needed time to gather herself after her ordeal. Several tense hours later, the drone was all set for its journey into the abyss, while the sheriff, the specialist, and I watched from a safe distance. Our eyes were glued to the screen as the drone began its descent, its light piercing the darkness, revealing nothing but the gnarled, wet rocks of the cave initially. Suddenly, shadows darted across the feed. Something white flickered briefly within the frame, making my heart skip a beat. The enigma deepened when the drone revealed an abandoned camera and a pair of boots, the operator's gear. However, just as we began to explore further, the specialist announced the onset of severe signal interference. We risked losing the drone, an expensive piece of equipment, if we pushed any further. After a quick discussion, we agreed to retrieve the abandoned camera before retreating. As the drone's mechanical claws lifted the camera, the feed grew erratic. The drone started to pull back, but it was then that the unthinkable happened. The drone, as if held by some unseen adversary, stopped abruptly and began inching back into the cave. The screen filled with static, and before our very eyes, the drone was dragged deeper into the cave. The camera slipped from its grasp and clattered onto the rocky floor. Instinct took over. Ignoring the cold tendrils of fear creeping up my spine, I rushed to grab the fallen camera. I had barely cleared the mouth of the cave when a guttural growl echoed behind me. I didn't look back. The sheriff, the specialist, and I returned to the cabin, our minds reeling with the eerie events. We were out of options, out of ideas. The cave was alive, dangerous, but as I clutched the retrieved camera, I held on to the sliver of hope it offered. As we sat down at the cabin, the retrieved camera's footage played out, unveiling a whole new level of horror. The girl from earlier, Emily, appeared on screen at first. She seemed to be narrating something about the cave, but then abruptly stopped, her words replaced by a silence that was deafening. Her silence spread, infecting Steve and the other reporter. They all stood frozen, like wax figures, breathless and vacant. After a few seconds, they started moving in unison towards the cave, their steps slow and mechanical, like marionettes being controlled by an unseen puppeteer. The cameraman, his own movements mimicking the others, continued to film. Emily, followed by the reporter, led by Steve, walked in a single file into the gaping mouth of the cave. The cameraman brought up the rear, his camera the only source of light illuminating their descent into darkness. Through the drone footage, I had already sensed an unnaturalness about the cave. Now, viewing it through the lens of the abandoned camera, I was certain. It looked less like a cave and more like an abandoned mine. The walls, the ground, everything bore signs of being man-made. Suddenly, the camera captured something that chilled me to my bones. Literally, human and animal bones, discarded carelessly, littered the floor of the cave. The sight was grotesque enough, but it was what happened next that imprinted a permanent scar on my soul. White shadows flickered into view. Human-like figures with an unnaturally pale skin moved slowly towards the group. One of them approached Steve, extending a hand that he took without protest. The figure led him away, disappearing into the darkness. One by one, the others followed suit. The reporter, Emily, all of them led away by these haunting figures. Finally, it was the cameraman's turn. Through his camera, we had our first close-up look at these creatures. The light from the camera revealed an almost translucent skin, through which a network of blue veins could be seen. The face, if it could be called that, was dominated by two black, lifeless eyes and a round mouth lined with sharp, fish-like teeth. A low, purring sound filled the hut as it reached out for the cameraman. The camera fell from the cameraman's grasp as he was led away. The last image that the camera captured was a pair of feet disappearing into the dark. Closing the camera, I placed it back in its case. The feeling of unease had morphed into a heavy dread, weighing my thoughts. I was consumed by a single question. How did Emily escape? With the image of her frantic escape and her story ringing in my ears, I raced to the room where I had left her earlier. I was met with an empty space. Her presence evaporated as though it never existed. My heart pounded with a new fear. I hurried back to the sheriff, my words tumbling over each other as I explained Emily's disappearance. To my surprise, the sheriff didn't seem taken aback. In fact, he seemed to dismiss my claims, asserting that when he had arrived that morning, there had been no girl. There was only me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. If he hadn't seen Emily, then what had I witnessed? Who was she? Was it all a trick of the mind? Or was it something more sinister? The uncertainty spun a web of fear, a fear that haunted me for years to come. Life eventually moved on, though the shadows of that event lurked in the corners of my mind. I transferred to another park, taking with me the scars of a past that refused to fade away. The whispers of the cave remained just that. Whispers. They echoed through the years, a chilling reminder of an enigma that had become my burden to bear. Oh my God, I'm in a lot of pain. My left leg is hurt, and my head is smashed. Hell, I feel terrible. It's very dark in here. I can't see anything. Where am I? All I remember is hearing something strange, and then I think I went underground. Yes, that's right. The ground was out from under me, and I fell down. But where did I fall? In a hole? It doesn't look like hell. When did it happen? How long had I been lying unconscious? God, I feel really bad. I have to get up. I have to find a way out of this darkness. Wait, what is that? What is that in the dark? I feel like I'm not alone. Someone's there, but who is it? The oppressive silence was terrifying, adding to the throbbing pain that ricocheted throughout my body. I groaned, clutching my left leg as a shard of agony sliced through it. Unbeknownst to me, I'd traded the familiar forest's comfort for a macabre chasm's eerie unknowns. I'd spent years patrolling the woods as a ranger, and I'd gotten to know every tree, every animal, every leaf rustling in the wind. But here, in this chilly, rocky underbelly, I was lost, out of my depth, my knowledge and my experience rendered useless. Gritting my teeth, I pushed myself upright. I couldn't find my hiking backpack with my flashlight. I must have lost it when I fell through. That's bad news. My hand fumbled into my pocket, fingers grazing something cold and metallic. My cell phone. With trembling fingers, I tapped at the screen, the sudden glare stinging my eyes. A sigh of relief escaped me as I switched on the flashlight function. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating sharp rocks and craggy walls. Turning the beam around, I felt a dread creep up my spine like a cold spider. The light caught something large and terrifying looming in the shadows. A ghastly sight met my eyes, the bright light reflecting off a massive jaw laden with sharp teeth and fangs, dripping with slime. My blood ran cold, my heart pounding against my rib cage as if desperate to escape its bony prison. The creature stirred, a low, rumbling growl vibrating through the air. It opened its maw, sucking in air, nostrils flaring as it picked up my scent. The flashlight's glare gleamed off the slick surface of its skin, exposing a network of pulsing blood vessels underneath. It was monstrous, a stark contrast to the docile creatures I had encountered during my time as a ranger. The bears, the largest predators in the forest, were nothing compared to this behemoth. I held my breath, my body freezing in terror. There was no way this creature belonged here, in the forests I knew like the back of my hand. It was something out of a nightmare, a grotesque abomination birthed from the darkest corners of the mind. My mind raced, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I had to make a decision. I had to escape, to get out of this godforsaken hole and back to the safety of the surface. The first realization came to me slowly, a half-formed thought creeping in from the periphery of my consciousness. The creature, this monstrous, hulking thing, wasn't reacting to the light from my flashlight. Its snout swung left and right, seeking out the source of the disturbance, yet its gaze never met the harsh white light of my cell phone. As my mind scrambled to make sense of this enigma, a single word echoed in the chambers of my brain: blind. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. It wasn't the light it was responding to, it was the sound, the scent. This creature, this monstrous inhabitant of the depths, it was blind, relying on its other senses to navigate the world. With my leg injured and head throbbing, I had to think quickly. I was a ranger. Years of training and experience in the wilderness had taught me to rely on my instincts. Using the light from my phone, I examined my surroundings. The hole I had fallen into was deep, much deeper than I'd initially thought. My survival was a miracle. The darkness held an eerie calm, silence punctuated by the occasional drip of water echoing off the cave walls. On the opposite side, I spotted a second hole. It was small, dark, a shadowy crevice that offered an unknown but potential escape from the monstrous creature. For a moment, I hesitated. What if there was another monster lurking in there, waiting for an unwitting victim to wander into its lair? But then the creature grunted, the sound echoing ominously, a chilling reminder of the danger before me. I watched in terrified fascination as it moved closer, its front legs disproportionately long and muscular compared to its back ones, dragging its hulking form across the rocky ground. Its jaw snapped, a savage symphony of bone and sinew resonating through the cavernous expanse. The scent of my blood, of fear, hung heavy in the air, luring the beast towards me like a moth to flame. My heart pounded in my chest, a deafening drum drowning out the creature's unsettling noises. I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to escape. I scanned the ground for something, anything that might serve as a distraction. My hand closed around a small pebble. With a swift flick of my wrist, I launched it into the darkness. The clattering echoed around us, a beacon calling to the beast. Its monstrous head snapped towards the sound, its attention diverted. I picked up another pebble and threw it towards the same spot. The creature turned its massive body, following the noise, moving away from me. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline and fear coursing through my veins as I took my chance. With the phone in one hand and supporting my weight on the other, I started to move, slowly, deliberately. The pain in my leg was a constant reminder of my vulnerability, but fear spurred me on. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly before me, but I knew I was moving in the right direction. I had to trust my instincts, had to believe that I could escape. The creature grunted again, its breath a chilling echo bouncing off the cave walls. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as I held my breath, praying it hadn't heard me. Silence followed, and then a soft thud, then another. The beast was moving away, following the sound of the pebbles. A soft sigh of relief escaped me as I resumed my agonizingly slow trek towards the dark hole, towards safety, or at least towards the hope of it. Just when I thought I had escaped the worst of it, the ground beneath me gave way. A sharp yelp escaped my lips as I tumbled down an incline, clutching my cell phone tightly as the world spun around me in dizzying circles. The harsh roll was a jagged dance, my battered body the unwilling participant. The descent was swift, the end abrupt as I collided with something hard and unsettlingly hollow. I groaned, pain spiking through my body. The realization that I was still in danger, still in this nightmare, was a bitter pill to swallow. I forced myself upright, my hand instinctively reaching for my cell phone. Flicking on the flashlight, I shone it around, the harsh white light illuminating the cave around me. The sight that greeted me sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through my veins. Towering above me was an enormous skull, the bones of an unknown creature splayed across the ground. The bones were much larger than the monster I had encountered earlier, a stark white and strangely smooth to the touch. The flashlight swept across the expanse of the cave, the light dancing off the pointed stalactites hanging from the ceiling. The floor was strewn with more bones, gigantic remains of creatures long gone. Other than the chilling remains, there was no sign of any living creature. A small mercy, perhaps. My heart pounded in my chest as the reality of the situation sank in. I was alone, in an underground cave filled with the remains of creatures unknown to man, with a monster lurking somewhere in the darkness. And I had 1 bar of battery left on my phone, my only source of light. Desperation set in, clawing its way through the numbing fear. I had to find a way out, had to escape this subterranean nightmare before the light blinked out. Survival was the only option. As I navigated through the cavern, careful to avoid the scattered bones, my flashlight beam swept across the cave walls. The light caught on etchings in the rock, intricate drawings that had been painstakingly carved into the stone. They depicted figures, primitive men with spears, surrounding a cave. A monstrous creature, much like the one I had encountered earlier, emerged from the cave, its long forelegs and enormous jaw menacingly outstretched. A chilling realization washed over me. The monster from the drawings, the bones scattered around me, they were the same, and the creature was even larger than the one I had seen earlier. I was in the belly of the beast's lair, surrounded by the bones of its predecessors. The drawings, the bones, they all told a story, a tale of man against monster, a battle for survival. With each step I took deeper into the cavern, I discovered more bones. Some were small, others enormous, but all equally bleached white and smooth. It was as though the cavern was a graveyard, a final resting place for these creatures, their remains serving as eerie monuments in this dark subterranean world. My every sense was on high alert, the familiar sounds of the forest replaced by the hollow echoes of the cave. Each unfamiliar noise resonated through the tunnels, a chilling symphony of the unknown. Every shuffle, every growl, sent fear prickling down my spine. I would freeze, barely daring to breathe, waiting for a confrontation with death. The anticipation was tormenting. The rustling would cease, only to resume again, an endless cycle of fear and relief. As of yet, I hadn't come face to face with any other monster, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, hunted. My instincts told me I wasn't alone in the darkness. The further I ventured, the more apparent it became that this was a complex network of caves and tunnels, an intricate labyrinth buried beneath the forest. This was the monster's lair, a domain crafted to their needs, an intricate network of tunnels and chambers, each with its own assortment of bones. It was a terrifying realization. I was deep in the heart of their territory, lost in a maze with no visible exit. My single bar of battery was dwindling fast. My only source of light was about to die, leaving me in complete darkness. With a sinking feeling, I noted that I had reached yet another cave. My flashlight barely pierced the gloom, illuminating only a fraction of the cavernous space. The immensity of the cave was staggering, the ceiling lost in shadows. The question gnawed at me. Was there even a way out? The thought was enough to send a shudder through me. The prospect of dying here, in this desolate labyrinth, hunted by unknown monsters, was more terrifying than anything I had ever faced. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help me here. I needed a clear head. I reached out, touching the cool cave wall. The rock was my guide, my lifeline in this maddening darkness. Suddenly, my world was consumed by darkness. The cell phone died without warning, stripping away my sight, leaving me blind in the pitch-black abyss of the cave. Panic surged through me, a primal fear of the unknown. I was acutely aware of my vulnerability. Feeling my way forward, I relied on my senses to navigate, one hand brushing the jagged rocks of the tunnel wall, my foot cautiously testing each step. The complete silence of the cave amplified each shuffle, each ragged breath. Without warning, the cavern came alive with an eerie rustling. The noise filled the tunnel, echoing ominously. A cold realization hit me. I was not alone. The rustling grew louder, resonating from both ahead and behind. I was surrounded. A wet, cold blob fell onto my clothes, sending chills down my spine. I reached up tentatively, and my heart sank as I recognized the sticky substance, monster's slime. A creature lurked just above me, its presence looming like a deathly shroud. Frozen with fear, I barely registered the light touch against my leg. I jerked away instinctively, swallowing a scream. But it was too late. They sensed me. With horrifying roars echoing around the cave, the creatures launched themselves towards me, a horde of ravenous monsters closing in. I stumbled blindly through the darkness, guided solely by fear and instinct. The darkness was all-consuming, the tunnel narrowing into an endless void. I tripped, fell, got up, and ran again. Suddenly, I crashed into a mass of something soft and slimy. I recoiled, realizing too late that I had collided with another monster. Twisting desperately, I felt sharp pain sear through my injured leg. It was pure, blinding agony, yet it was my survival instinct that prevailed. Fighting through the pain, I grappled for a rock, seizing one just in time to strike at the creature that had gripped my leg. The creature bellowed, releasing its grip, but not before shredding through my pants and tearing into the flesh of my ankle. Blood flowed freely, adding another layer of fear. Leaning heavily against the cave wall, I stumbled on, adrenaline forcing me to ignore the pain. My mind screamed at me to escape, to find safety. And then the ground beneath me gave way. I tumbled down, a helpless ragdoll in the grip of gravity. The impact jarred my body, my head striking something hard. Pain exploded in my skull, stars dancing before my eyes. And then, the world faded away. Unconsciousness swept over me like a wave, pulling me under its dark spell. Consciousness returned in fragments, my senses piecing together the reality of my situation. I woke up alone in the dark, the silence of the underground maze pressing on me from all sides. My head pounded with a fierce ache, nausea rose from the pit of my stomach, and my throat felt as parched as a desert. The pain was a relentless burn in my body, the wounds throbbing in protest of the abuse they'd endured. Feverish heat radiated from my injuries, exhaustion holding me captive. I could barely think, my mind weighed down by fatigue and impending doom. As I lay there, my hand came across something soft in the darkness. Curiosity momentarily displacing my fear, I grasped it. The recognition of my traveling bag in my hand was like finding an old friend in an unknown city. Fumbling in the dark, I searched through the bag until my fingers found the cool, familiar grip of my knife and the cylindrical form of my flashlight. The flashlight flickered to life, illuminating the darkness in a narrow beam. What I saw next snuffed out any joy of my discovery like a gust of wind extinguishing a flame. Hanging precariously close to my face was a monstrous jaw, its gaping maw filled with terrifyingly sharp teeth. The sight froze me in place, a grim vision of my impending doom. With a rush of adrenaline and fear, I unknowingly plunged my knife into the gaping maw of the creature on instinct. The monster recoiled, letting out a chilling cry of agony. Seizing the moment, I grasped my backpack, flashlight in hand, and dragged myself away from the wounded beast. I had seen an opening, a flicker of hope. Move, faster, even faster, be patient. Aren't you in pain? Do you want to die here? Damn it all, I have to survive. I know I can. I forced myself forward, repeating my inner monologue and motivating myself to survive. The monster's howls echoed through the tunnels, an ominous warning that had undoubtedly alerted the other creatures. In the faint glow of the flashlight, I saw them emerging from the shadows, drawn by the scent of fresh blood and their wounded kin. Then, the ground beneath me rumbled, shaking with a primal force that made my blood run cold. From a vast opening in the cave, a monstrous form emerged, its silhouette far more enormous than anything I'd seen before. Long white whiskers protruded from his ugly head. The tips of the tendrils glowed in the dark, a nightmarish parody of the lanterns in the abyss. Unlike its smaller kin, this behemoth seemed to sense me. He didn't just feel me, it felt like he could practically see me. Its roar filled the cavern, a deafening announcement of its intentions. It lunged forward with terrifying speed, a predator zeroing in on its prey. In that moment, I realized the grim truth. I had stumbled upon the heart of their nest. I was in the lair of monsters, a lone human lost in their underworld. My instincts roared a single, unambiguous command: run. Nothing I'd encountered in my life as a ranger had prepared me for the horror of a colossal monster chasing me through the darkness of an underground labyrinth. My left leg was failing me, and I struggled and limped to avoid death. The monster seemed to gain on me, the ground quaking with its movements. My mind raced, searching for some means of defense. My hand reached into my bag and pulled out a canister of gas, a remnant from my camping gear. Breathing hard, each gasp a desperate plea for survival, I fumbled with the canister. My fingers found the release valve, and I twisted it open, the smell of fuel filling the air. With a swift, desperate motion, I lit the gas, creating an impromptu torch. The fuel ignited in a burst of light, a desperate blazing beacon in the all-consuming darkness. I hurled the improvised weapon at the monstrous creature. Flames exploded across its form, illuminating the cave with a harsh, dancing light. The monster reeled, letting out a roar that reverberated through the tunnels. However, my victory was short-lived. The monster, though stunned, was far from defeated. The fire did little more than enrage it further, its pursuit of me becoming even more relentless. I ran, the ache in my wounded leg intensifying with each desperate step. My lungs screamed for oxygen, each breath drawn was sharp and tasted of desperation. But there was no respite. The beast was close at my heels. Just when I thought my strength would falter, I heard it. The sound of rushing water echoing through the cavern. Hope ignited within me. I pushed myself harder, my destination crystal clear. I had to reach the river. It was my only chance of survival. The roar of the monster behind me grew deafening. I could feel its hot breath on my neck, its massive form closing the gap between us. With my last ounce of strength, I lunged towards the roaring water. Time seemed to freeze as I hurled myself into the river. The chilling current gripped me instantly, pulling me away from the monster's reach. As the river carried me into the depths of the unknown, I dared to hope that I had escaped the beast's clutches, at least for the moment. The monstrous roar became a distant echo as the swift current whisked me further into the darkness. The river's icy clutches yanked me under, its cold grip stronger than any beast I had faced. My lungs screamed for air, each gasp replaced by freezing water. The pain was eclipsed by the blinding terror of drowning. My struggles against the current were in vain, my body failing, my strength depleted. I fell into a deep pit and remained alive and almost unharmed. Faced monsters, traversed a network of tunnels and caves in total darkness, escaped a huge monster. I was able to do the impossible, but now it was this unstoppable river, a simple force of nature that threatened to destroy my existence, take me away into the abyss of the bottom. My injured leg was dead weight, dragging me towards the river's icy depths. My clothes, soaked and heavy, clung to me like a shroud. Each frantic kick and stroke barely kept my head above water. The world started to fade, the edges of my vision blurring and dimming. I was drowning, and there was nothing I could do about it. In my fading consciousness, my hand grasped onto something solid, a piece of driftwood. My fingers clenched around it with the last vestiges of my strength. It was my lifeline, my only hope of survival, and I clung to it with every ounce of determination left in me. And then, with a final shuddering gasp, I lost consciousness. When I next opened my eyes, the suffocating darkness had been replaced by a harsh fluorescent light. I was lying in a hospital bed, a far cry from the shadowy caverns I had last remembered. My body ached, and my leg throbbed with pain, but I was alive. The police were waiting for me to regain consciousness, a mix of concern and curiosity etched on their faces. They told me how I had been found by a group of fishermen, unconscious and clinging to a piece of driftwood. To my disbelief, I was discovered a few miles from where I was patrolling the woods and where I had supposedly fallen underground. In the days following, I drifted in and out of consciousness, my body slowly recovering from its harrowing ordeal. Questions swirled around me like a storm, the police desperate for answers. But how could I tell them? How could I describe the creatures lurking in the darkness, the maze of tunnels, the terror that had stalked me in the abyss? The experience had shattered me, leaving a profound impact that no amount of therapy could mend. I realized, with a heavy heart, that I could no longer face the woods. I had a lot of questions that I didn't know the answer to, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going back to the woods. I was leaving the ranger service forever. The sun had long since set behind the horizon, plunging the national park into impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow the very soul of the forest. The only source of light was the pale moon, casting long shadows that danced and writhed as the wind whispered through the treetops. I had been a park ranger for over 10 years, but the eerie silence of the night never failed to send shivers down my spine. I stood and breathed in the scent of the wild forest, the clean and fresh air clearing my thoughts. My name is Daniel, and I grew up in a small town near the park. The vast expanses of wilderness always called to me, and when the opportunity arose to work in the very heart of the place that captured my imagination as a child, I couldn't resist. As I sat at the ranger station, I remembered the last report of a missing person. A family of 4 had gone hiking in one of the remote areas of the park, but only 3 returned. The father, a man in his 40s named Thomas, had gone alone to gather firewood and never came back. Search teams combed the area for several days, but he was nowhere to be seen. It seemed as though he had simply vanished into thin air. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm me. The weight of my responsibilities was becoming heavier with each passing day, and the thought of sleep was becoming more of a distant dream than a reality. The worn leather of the chair creaked beneath me as I stood and stretched, feeling the aches in my bones that only years of work in the wild could bring. Another long night, I muttered to myself as I stepped out into the cold, crisp air. The stars overhead seemed almost close enough to touch, their twinkling light reflecting off the snowy ground. The night was quiet, except for the distant howl of a lone wolf, whose mournful cry echoed through the darkness. I decided to take a walk to clear my head, hoping that the peaceful tranquility of the night would help calm my anxious thoughts. As I strolled along the winding path leading away from the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. My instincts, honed by years of living in the wild, screamed for me to turn back, but I stubbornly pushed on, determined to confront whatever was making me so uneasy. The further I walked, the more my sense of unease grew until I found myself in a part of the park that was almost unrecognizable. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, clawing at my throat. And then I heard a voice, so faint that it was almost drowned out by the rustling of leaves. "Help me!" My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear the voice again. For a moment, there was only silence, and then, just as I was about to give up and turn back, the voice spoke again, this time a little louder. "Help me!" I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest as I pushed through the underbrush. The voice seemed to be coming from a small clearing up ahead, and as I drew closer, I saw a figure huddled on the ground. It was a woman, her clothing torn and her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Please," she sobbed, her eyes widening in terror as they met mine. "You have to help me. There's something out here. It took my husband, and it's coming back for me." I knelt beside her, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what she was saying. I had so many questions, but now was not the time for that. We needed to get her to safety, and we needed to do it quickly. "Let's go," I said, helping her to her feet. "We need to get you back to the ranger station. We'll figure everything out once we're safe." As we stumbled our way back through the forest, the woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, told me her story, gasping for breath in between words. She and her husband had been on a hike when Thomas went to gather firewood. When he didn't return, Sarah went looking for him, but came face to face with something she couldn't describe. It looked like a person, but not, she whispered, her voice trembling. Its eyes were empty, and it moved in ways I've never seen before. It took Thomas, and I don't know what it did to him, but I heard his screams, and they were like nothing I've ever heard before. Back at the station, I settled Sarah in as comfortably as I could, and tried to make sense of what she had told me. The thought of a creature like the one she described was horrifying, but hardly believable. I had heard stories from the local Native American tribe about creatures they called skinwalkers, beings that could take the form of animals or even other people. They were said to be powerful and malevolent, but those were just myths. In my experience, the most frightening and dangerous creature was human. I called for backup and decided to leave Sarah at the station. Time was working against us, so I needed to urgently set out to search for her husband. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I moved cautiously, my senses heightened, every nerve in my body on edge. After a while, I heard distant cries for help. The sound was faint, barely audible above the rustling of leaves and light wind, but it was unmistakable. My heart leapt into my throat and I quickened my pace. As I delved deeper into the heart of the forest, the cries became louder and more urgent. I pushed my body to its limits, my lungs burned, and my legs ached as I raced to close the distance between myself and the desperate pleas echoing through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker, the air more oppressive with each passing moment. When I finally arrived at the source of the cries, I was met with a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. In a small clearing bathed in moonlight stood an elk, its towering form silhouetted against the night sky. But this was no ordinary elk. Its body was devoid of muscle and fat, the skin stretched taut over its skeletal frame. I felt my blood run cold as I realized I was in the presence of a skinwalker, the very creature that had inspired so many legends and ghost stories. For a moment, I stood frozen in place, my terror so great it felt as though all my limbs had turned to stone. But then, when the creature let out a low, guttural growl, I snapped into action, turning to run as primal, animalistic fear compelled me to put as much distance between myself and the nightmare in the clearing as possible. As I ran, the forest became a blur, trees and undergrowth whipping past me, carrying me deeper into the darkness. The cries for help echoed behind me, growing more chilling with each passing moment. Despite my terror, I felt a pull toward the sound, compelling me to meet the unknown and confront the malevolent force that ruled the woods. Finally, as I approached the source of the cries, a figure emerged before me, humanoid, yet not quite human. Its skin was as taut and lifeless as the elk's, its eyes empty and soulless, boring into my being. The tracker had transformed, assuming a new, even more terrifying guise. I recoiled, gasping for air, as I turned to run once more, my being consumed by the need to flee from the terror stalking my every step. The forest closed in around me, the darkness pressing down like a weight, and I ran, driven by fear that threatened to consume me entirely. And then, just when I thought I could run no longer, I stumbled upon Thomas, battered and bruised but alive. Relief washed over me, a sudden wild joy that seemed to chase away the darkness, if only for a moment. With each step we took back to the ranger station, adrenaline and the desperate need to escape the terror that had pursued us spurred us on. When we emerged from the tree line, the forest seemed to recede around us, breathing ragged, our bodies covered in sweat and shaking from exhaustion. We took a moment to catch our breath, to relish in the fact that we had survived our encounter with the unimaginable. As we stumbled back to the ranger station, Sarah ran to embrace her husband, tears of relief streaming down her face as she clung to him tightly. The joy of their reunion was a balm to my frayed nerves, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is still hope. But even as we celebrated our salvation, we could not shake the nagging feeling that our ordeal was far from over. In the distance, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves in the wind, came a faint cry for help. The skinwalker was still out there, waiting, and we knew that our battle with the darkness had only just begun. It's been a decade since I first stepped foot in Greenleaf National Park as its head ranger. The lush foliage, the centuries-old trees, the bubbling brooks, and thriving wildlife. I love it all. I've devoted every single day of these past 10 years to protect this magnificent patch of earth that, over time, has felt more like home than any house I've lived in. But now, things have begun to change, and not in a way I can explain. I remember vividly the day when my assistant of many years, Jerry, left his post due to a heart condition. His grizzled face softened by sorrow, his eyes moist. This park was as much a part of him as it was of me. His departure meant a new assistant was due, a man named Tom. I didn't know anything about Tom, but anyone willing to work in the wilderness was okay in my books, or so I thought. When Tom arrived, the park was in the thick of summer. Families were swarming the campsites, children laughing and scampering around like woodland creatures. Tom was quiet, but efficient. He took to his duties with a sober dedication that I admired. The first few weeks passed smoothly. The park thrived in its sunlit glory, and Tom fell into the rhythm of the place. However, the calm didn't last. The first incident was a couple of dead squirrels near the eastern trail. I thought nothing of it initially. Nature is, after all, a brutal cycle of life and death. Then, one early morning, I discovered a mutilated raccoon. I've never seen an animal attack like this, I confessed to Tom, who merely shrugged in response, his eyes averted from the grisly sight. With the passing days, the corpses of animals began to multiply, growing more grotesque and larger. A torn-apart deer, a bear cub cut into pieces. Each discovery twisted my stomach into a knot, causing me to worry about my park. "We have to do something, Tom," I insisted. "We can't just ignore this." He agreed, and we began to set traps, monitor the trails more intensively, alert the visitors to be cautious. I contacted the authorities, but their disinterest was palpable. "It's probably just a rogue bear, Michael. These things happen," they said. I wish it were that simple. Then, the disappearances started. The first were a group of college students who ventured into the deeper trails for a camping trip. They never returned. The search parties yielded nothing. The eeriness started settling deeper into my bones when a young married couple vanished without a trace, leaving behind a half-eaten meal at their campsite. The park was no longer a place of peace. It was a breeding ground for fear. I tried to unravel the mystery, plunging deeper into the park than I'd ever been before. The whispers among the park staff grew louder, and so did the nightmares. Shadowy figures lurking behind trees, eerie howls that weren't from any known animal. The feeling of being watched. My once serene haven was now filled with unnamed horrors. "Something is wrong here, Tom," I told him one evening as we sat by the ranger station, the forest a dark silhouette against the night sky. "It's not just some rogue animal. We're dealing with something different." "Different how?" Tom asked, his gaze finally meeting mine. "I don't know. Yet," I confessed, a chill running down my spine as the wind howled through the desolate park. I could only hope we'd find out before it was too late. I found the place by accident. It was tucked away in a remote corner of the park where few ever ventured. The clearing was lined with a crude stone circle, symbols etched onto the stones, covered in a dry, flaky substance that looked a lot like blood. My heart pounded in my chest as I traced the symbols with my fingers, the eerie familiarity of them sending a shiver down my spine. Strewn about the clearing were items, personal belongings, clothing, and body parts. An arm here, a leg there, and in the center, a skull. Eyes still intact, staring up at the sky in silent horror. My mind raced back to the missing campers, the young couple. Were these theirs? Were they victims of some horrific, twisted ritual? Was this the work of cultists? A maniac? The thought filled me with dread. I reported my findings to the police, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. The park had been turned into a hunting ground by some madman. Detective Brad, the head of the case, listened in silence, his tone grave. "Michael, first of all, I'm sorry I didn't listen to you right away when you asked for help. I know I got involved after the hikers disappeared, but what I found out makes me worried. I haven't figured it all out yet, and I have questions, a lot of weird questions, but..." He finally spoke, his voice heavy. "Michael, for now, keep an eye on your assistant, Tom." I felt my blood run cold. "Tom? Why?" "I don't have concrete proof yet," Brad admitted, "but some things aren't adding up about him. Just watch him. Be careful." The line went dead, leaving me with my thoughts. Tom. Could he really be involved in all this? In the days that followed, I observed Tom more closely. His mannerisms, his routines. I found myself watching him for any signs of deceit. He seemed the same, dedicated and quiet, yet doubt gnawed at me. One evening, as Tom ventured deeper into the woods, I made my move. Using my spare key, I entered his cabin. I told myself it was necessary, that it was to find the truth. His belongings were ordinary: clothes, books, a toothbrush. Then I stumbled upon a worn, leather-bound book tucked away in his drawer. The symbols on the cover matched those I had found in the clearing. A cold realization swept over me as I flipped through its pages. Diagrams of rituals, detailed notes, cryptic messages. It was all there. Underneath the book, I found an ID. The face on the card was not the Tom I knew. The name read Tom Bennett, but the face was that of a stranger. A pang of betrayal washed over me. This man was not Tom. He was an imposter, a murderer masquerading in a stolen identity. I ran back to my cabin, my mind a whirl of thoughts and fears. I picked up the phone and dialed Brad's number. I spilled everything in hurried, anxious sentences. There was silence at the other end, then a deep sigh. "Michael, lock your doors and stay put. We're coming." When the cops arrived, their presence brought a momentary relief. Their stern faces and loaded weapons filled me with a sense of hope. Perhaps we could end this nightmare. Brad, a few cops, and I prepared to venture into the heart of the park. As we headed deeper into the forest, I felt an unsettling change. The air was colder, heavier, as if carrying the weight of a hidden terror. Even the trees seemed darker, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Brad and I took the lead, our footsteps muffled by the underbrush. The rest of the police force scattered throughout the rest of the park. Then came the gunshots, shattering the eerie silence. I jerked around, my heart pounding in my chest. Screams followed, a symphony of terror resonating through the woods. "West, west, something big, shadow, I can't..." The radio hissed with static, the words of the officer from the west barely discernible. His sentence was cut short by a scream and a growl that curdled my blood. Without a word, Brad and I moved towards the west, the chilling echoes of the screams guiding our path. The forest, once a safe haven, now loomed ominously, the shadows seeming to grow and twist with each passing second. The scene we stumbled upon was grotesque. Pieces of human bodies littered the ground and hung from the trees, torn apart by something ferocious. The sight threatened to bring my dinner back up, the metallic scent of blood overwhelming. "Brad, we need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. He nodded, his face pale as he reached for his radio. "All officers, retreat. I repeat, retreat now." No response came. The radio crackled ominously in the deafening silence. He tried again and again, but it was as if we were the last people left in the world. Realization struck me like a sledgehammer, my heart pounding in sync with the terror coursing through my veins. The officers, my friends, were dead. It was only Brad and me. And somewhere out there was the false Tom, the man behind the ritualistic killings. But there was also something else. Something monstrous. Something I couldn't fathom. A terror that even the killer himself might fear. The rustling behind us snapped me out of my thoughts. Brad and I turned around in unison to find ourselves facing a grotesque sight. It was massive, covered in shaggy fur, its long arms ending in razor-sharp claws. The creature's face was obscured by hair, but there was no missing the oversized jaws filled with teeth that looked like they could chew through metal. The horrifying sight of the creature was made all the more abhorrent by the figure protruding from its back. The false Tom, twisted and deformed, was growing out of the beast, his face twisted into a malevolent grin. I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey my commands. Brad, to his credit, immediately pulled out his weapon and began firing. The creature dodged with ease, charging towards us with a bone-chilling roar. "Run, Michael!" Brad ordered, stepping in between me and the monster. It was his command that finally unfroze me. I turned and ran, the deafening sound of gunshots and the monster's roar echoing in my ears. I'm no hero. Fear drove me, pumping adrenaline through my veins as I sprinted towards my cabin. Fumbling with my keys, I managed to get inside my pickup and ignite the engine. As I drove towards town, I dared a glance at my rearview mirror. There he was, the false Tom. He was back in his human form, grinning madly, waving as if saying goodbye. The night was a blur of panic and phone calls, of reinforcements and a sense of impending doom. Local hunters, volunteers, and additional cops flooded Greenleaf Park, their torches flickering like stars against the enveloping darkness. We found remnants of the carnage, the detective's badge, pieces of what used to be my friends. But of the monster and the false Tom, there was no trace. The woods felt different, lighter perhaps, but not devoid of that feeling of being watched. The story spread quickly, turning into legend. They say that the shaggy monster with a man growing from its back still roams the woods. Some claim to have seen it lurking among the trees. As for me, I can't shake off the feeling that the creature is still there. I was just another eager-faced recruit fresh out of the academy when I first set foot in Silent Pines National Park. My name's Mark, by the way. I felt an instant bond, a visceral connection with the place. It wasn't just the wildlife or the majesty of the towering pines. It was the solitude, the promise of untamed adventure. I thought I was ready for anything, but the wilderness quickly proved me wrong. The first few weeks were filled with routine duties, ensuring campers abided by the rules, dealing with minor wildlife encounters, issuing warnings for illegal bonfires. It was mundane, but I savored every moment. It was my dream, after all, to be a ranger. Then the strangeness began. I remember the first time vividly. I'd been doing the dawn patrol when I came across a sight that made my stomach turn. A roe deer, lifeless. Its body was not just killed, it was savaged, ripped apart in a manner that was almost personal. Unsettling, yes, but it was the wilderness. Predator and prey, it's the law of the land. Yet it was the brutality of the attack that had me unnerved. I've seen the results of bear attacks before. This was different, more vicious. That evening, I shared my concerns with my fellow rangers, but they shrugged it off, attributing the attack to some large, displaced predator. It's the circle of life, they'd said. More incidents followed. A bear, an elk, a raccoon, each more vicious than the last. This was no ordinary predator. I felt it in my bones. There was something out there, something stronger, more ferocious than a bear. Maybe it's a grizzly. They can do a lot of damage, Bill, a veteran ranger, suggested one day as we surveyed another mutilated carcass. No, this isn't the work of a grizzly. It's something else, I argued. I wasn't a seasoned expert like Bill, but even I knew grizzlies didn't kill like this. Bill just chuckled and patted me on the shoulder. You're letting your imagination run wild, kid. It's just nature doing its thing. But his eyes were tight, his smile forced. Despite their dismissal, the incidents were taking a toll on everyone. There was an undercurrent of anxiety among the rangers, a ripple of fear among the campers. The once comforting solitude of the park felt oppressive, hostile even. I found myself spending my nights poring over books and animal attack reports, searching for something, anything, that could explain the escalating violence. Yet, each search left me feeling more helpless, more alone in my quest for answers. One evening, as I sat huddled over my makeshift research station, Sarah, a fellow ranger, joined me. Sarah was a botanist by training, her affinity for plants and fungi rivaling my own for the animal kingdom. We had built a comfortable camaraderie over shared hikes and campfire stories. Her presence was a balm to the growing unease. "Still playing detective, Mark?" she teased, looking at the scattered documents on the table. "Someone has to," I retorted, managing a weary smile. She glanced at a particularly gruesome photo, her joviality fading. "I wish I could say you're wrong, that it's just the way of the wild, but this ... s unsettling." Her admission that I wasn't alone in my fear was oddly comforting. We spent the rest of the night sharing our theories, delving into the folklore of predatory beasts that stalk the wild, fueling our speculations. It was a morbid topic, yet it felt good to be able to discuss it without dismissal. As weeks turned into months, I felt the park changing around me. It was as if a dark shadow had settled over the verdant woods, the once lively chatter of the forest now hushed, the animals unusually scarce. The continuing attacks had put everyone on edge, the air heavy with a tension that felt almost palpable. Despite the fear, I refused to let the unknown deter me from my duties. I found solace in the routine patrols, the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the forest floor serving as a grounding mantra against the building dread. I used these moments of solitude to train myself, pushing my senses to their limits, trying to tune in to the subtlest whispers of the forest. The park was my canvas, a vast expanse of uncharted wilderness. I began by mapping out the locations of the killings, marking each incident with a red dot. A pattern soon emerged. The attacks were concentrated in the remote northern sector, an area of the park rarely frequented by visitors, dense with foliage and riddled with hidden caves and clefts. It was as if the beast had a territory, a hunting ground. Day in and day out, I ventured into the northern woods, the heart of the beast's domain. I was a stranger in this part of the park, the thick undergrowth unfamiliar, the silence eerie. Yet the solitude and danger of the wilderness were a small price to pay for the answers that lay hidden within its depths. Every morning, armed with my camera, my notebook, and my unyielding resolve, I would venture deeper into the forest. The rich scent of pine, the soft chatter of the forest creatures, the ancient hush that seemed to echo in the wind. Everything was a potential clue. One late afternoon, after hours of trudging through the dense undergrowth, I stumbled upon something strange. My eyes, now accustomed to searching for anomalies in the forest, spotted an unusual indentation in the soft earth. A footprint. It was larger than any I had seen before, its outline harsh against the forest floor. The print was strange, a bizarre amalgamation of several species yet belonging to none. It had the size of a bear's, the claw marks of a big cat, but the overall shape was wrong. It didn't fit into any category of wildlife I knew of. I felt a chill run down my spine as I traced the edges of the print with my fingers. This was a tangible proof of the unknown terror, a silent proclamation of its existence. Intrigued and more than a little scared, I took several photographs, sketched the footprint in my notebook, and even made a plaster cast to examine later. I planned to reach out to experts. Maybe someone in the vast world outside Silent Pines could provide me with answers. One morning, after yet another sleepless night filled with monstrous dreams and haunting silences, I ventured further north than I ever had. My senses were on high alert, my every instinct screaming at me that I was venturing into forbidden territory, the den of the beast. With each passing minute, the feeling of being watched intensified, a prickle at the back of my neck, an icy sensation creeping down my spine. The gaze was almost tangible, like the cold touch of winter or the searing heat of a midday sun. Yet each time I turned around, there was nothing but the silent forest staring back at me. Ignoring the chill of fear that clung to me, I pushed forward. For hours I trudged on, my steps silent in the thick carpet of pine needles, my heartbeat thunderous in my ears. All the while the unseen eyes never wavered, tracking my every move, sizing me up. I was the intruder here, the unwanted guest. The feeling of being watched was unrelenting, my own shadow an unreliable companion. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that the sensation reached its crescendo. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, the hairs on my arms standing on end. And then, as if materializing out of the encroaching twilight, there it was, a shadow, a silhouette far larger than any creature in these woods should cast. My breath hitched as I took in its size. This was no figment of my imagination, no trick of the fading light. There was something out there, something monstrous, something unnatural. The shadow shifted. A faint rustle of leaves its only announcement. And then, as swiftly as it had appeared, it was gone. There was no trace of the entity that had held me captive with its gaze. There was only the silent wilderness, a darkened maze, hiding its secrets behind veils of shadow and fear. I stood there, in that cold, quiet clearing, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. The day after my encounter with the shadow, I spent the better part of the morning setting up traps in the northern sector. My objective was not to harm, but to capture, to finally come face to face with the entity that had become my constant nightmare. I knew it was a risky plan. Trapping a predatory beast in its own territory was a dangerous gamble. But the answers I sought were within reach, hidden in the shadows of the wilderness, lurking in the depths of my fear. The traps I set were humane, designed to restrain rather than harm. I used my knowledge of the park and the patterns I had observed to select the locations, hoping to lure the creature into my carefully laid plan. 24 hours later, armed with binoculars and a healthy dose of courage, I positioned myself on a ridge overlooking the area where I had set the traps. The early morning light painted the forest in a wash of golden hues, the serenity a stark contrast to the tension that thrummed through my veins. After hours of patient observation, there was a sudden flurry of movement near one of the traps. A figure emerged from the dense undergrowth, its size and form leaving no room for doubt. It was the creature, the beast of silent pines, and it was caught in my trap. Through the lenses of my binoculars, I could see it clearer than ever. Towering with a broad-shouldered frame covered in thick matted fur, it was a monstrous silhouette brought to life. But it wasn't a silhouette of a predator known to these parts. No, it was something straight out of folklore, a creature of myth and legend. It was Bigfoot. The sight of the creature left me frozen. I had heard the tales, of course, the stories shared around the campfire, whispers of the elusive giant of the woods. Yet, seeing it in person was a different story. The sheer size of it, the raw power evident in its muscular frame, it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The Bigfoot thrashed and growled, testing the strength of the trap. Each flex of its muscles, each snarl of frustration was a harsh reminder of the creature's power. I knew I was no match for it, not physically. A part of me yearned to approach, to get a closer look at the legendary creature. But the ranger in me, the protector of both the park and myself, held me back. I continued to watch from my safe distance, the creature in the trap, and I locked in a tense stalemate. As the hours passed, however, a sense of unease began to creep in, a growing suspicion that I was not alone. The familiar feeling of being watched came back, and after a while I noticed movement in the surrounding undergrowth. Holding my breath, I adjusted the focus, trying to discern what was hidden in the shadows. And then, as if a veil had been lifted, I saw them. More creatures. More Bigfoots. It was a small group, their towering silhouettes almost blending into the thick foliage. They moved with caution, their eyes never leaving the trapped creature. It was then I realized the truth, a truth that both amazed and terrified me. I was not just dealing with a lone Bigfoot, but a family that had come to rescue one of their own. The rescue operation was swift and precise. They worked together, their size and strength making quick work of the trap. I could only watch in disbelief as the captive Bigfoot was freed, a cheer of triumph echoing through the forest. The family regrouped, their hulking forms disappearing into the dense undergrowth, leaving behind a broken trap and a stunned ranger. In the quiet aftermath of the rescue, as I tried to process the enormity of what I had just witnessed, a noise startled me from my thoughts. It was a low growl, a warning coming from behind me. My blood ran cold, my mind screaming at me to run. Slowly, I turned around, coming face to face with the beastly eyes of another Bigfoot. The Bigfoot watched me, its gaze holding a mixture of anger and warning. It towered over me, a living embodiment of the wild, a creature straight out of myths and legends. It growled once more, a final warning, before turning and disappearing into the thicket of the forest. In the days that followed, an uneasy peace fell over Silent Pines. The killing of animals in the park stopped. The Bigfoots, it seemed, had left, their presence now just a memory, a shadow that had lifted. I was left with a tale that was too fantastical, too surreal to be believed. Who would believe that the Silent Pines had been the home of a family of Bigfoots? Who would believe that a young ranger had witnessed a creature of legends, had come face to face with a myth brought to life? The rational part of me hesitated, doubted if anyone would believe my story. Yet the experience had left an indelible mark on me. I would remember the encounter for the rest of my life, the memory of the Bigfoots forever etched in my mind. Silent Pines, my home, my sanctuary, was now a part of a larger world, a world where legends roamed, where the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary was blurred. The encounter with the Bigfoots changed me, made me see the world in a different light. I realized then that the wilderness was not just a place of tranquility, but also a realm of mystery, a land where myths came alive, where the known and the unknown coexisted. As the protector of Silent Pines, I knew I had a role to play in preserving this delicate balance, in ensuring that the legends remain undisturbed, hidden in the shadows of the wild.